Have you ever, stopped to wonder where that rainwater puddle actually goes after the rain stops? Or maybe why your garden plants seem thirsty again, even after you've just watered them? Feels like the water just vanishes, right?
Right.
Well, today we're doing a deep dive into exactly that. We're looking at two super important ways water leaves the earth and travels back up into the atmosphere. We're talking about evaporation and transpiration. Think of it like water taking this huge invisible elevator ride straight up. Our mission today, to really unpack the science behind this journey, why it matters so much for, well, everything from farming to our weather, and also how scientists and engineers actually try to measure it. We want to explore what makes water go up, how you can sort of see it happening through data, and how we guess how much is making the skyward trip.
Right. That's right. And what's fascinating here is that these processes, evaporation and this transpiration from plants, they are absolutely fundamental. They're key parts of the planet's water cycle, really driven by the sun's energy. And understanding them helps us manage water for drinking, for growing food, even for understanding our climate better. It's a bit like being a detective trying to track where the water goes. We got some great material to help us, including an interactive report from the ASCE Hydrology Handbook. It lays out the physics and some really clever ways we estimate these processes.
Okay, great. So we know they're critical. Let's really get into the mechanics then. What's actually happening when water makes this journey up? Let's start with evaporation. Picture that puddle on the pavement again. The sun shines down, warms the water up, and those little water molecules start zipping around faster and faster.
Yeah.
Eventually, some get enough energy to just break free from the surface, turning into this invisible gas water vapor. And then, poof, they float up into the air. That's why the puddle shrinks and eventually disappears. It didn't soak in, well, not all of it maybe, it went up. Okay, so that's water from like puddles and lakes. But plants do something similar, right? That's the transpiration part.
Exactly. Plants are constantly drawing water up from the soil through their roots. That water travels up through the stem to the leaves. And the leaves have these tiny little pores, they're called stomata. Plants need these open to take in carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, making their food. But when those pores are open, water vapor escapes out into the atmosphere. It's like the plants are breathing out water.
Huh, breathing out water. I like that. So both puddles and plants are sending water back to the sky.
Precisely. And together, we often lump them into one term, evapotranspiration, or ET. And this combined process moves a truly staggering amount of water. Think about it. If farmers know the ET rate for their fields,
They know how much water the crops are actually using, not just how much rain fell.
exactly, so they can irrigate much more efficiently, save water, grow better crops. And for scientists predicting weather or studying climate change, knowing the ET is crucial for their models. Which brings us to the big question.
What's actually powering all this? What gives the water the push to go up?
Well, you hinted at it earlier.
The sun. Right. It's got to be the sun's energy. It's like the engine for this whole process. I mean, think about drying clothes on a line. Sunny, warm day, they dry super fast.
Yeah.
Cold, damp day, takes forever. It's the same idea, just on a massive scale.
It is, and that speed difference you mentioned relates directly to how much water vapor the air can actually hold. Warm air can hold a lot more water vapor than cold air. It's like warm air is thirstier.
Okay, so the air's thirst. How do scientists measure that?
They use a value called saturation vapor pressure, often written as $. It tells us the maximum amount of water vapor the air can hold at a specific temperature. And our sources show just how sensitive this is. Like at one temperature, the air might be full at, say, 3.167 kilopascals of vapor pressure. But just increase the temperature by 1 degree Celsius, and that capacity changes by about 1.145 kilopascals.
Wow, so even a small temperature change makes a noticeable difference in how much water the air wants to grab.
A huge difference, especially when you scale it up. Warmer air is just much, much hungrier for water vapor. This creates a stronger pull, a steeper gradient for evaporation to happen. It's fundamental.
That makes sense. So the sun provides the heat makes the air thirsty, and the thirsty air pulls the water up.
In essence, yes. And this connects directly to something called the energy balance. Think of it like a budget for the sun's energy when it hits the Earth's surface.
A budget. Okay, like how you spend money.
Exactly like that. The total energy coming in that gets absorbed, we call that net radiation, has to be spent somehow. It gets divided up. Some of that energy budget is used to turn liquid water into vapor. That's the latent heat flux, lambda E1. It's latent or hidden because it doesn't raise the temperature right away. The energy is stored in the vapor.
Right, like potential energy, almost.
Sort of, yes. Then another chunk of the energy budget goes into directly warming the air above the surface. That's the sensible heat flux, H, the heat we can actually feel or sense.
Okay, warming the air. Got it.
And finally, some energy goes into warming the ground itself. That's the ground heat flux, G.
So the incoming energy water era is split between evaporating water, lambda E, heating the air, H, and heating the ground.
Precisely. $1 is lambda E plus H plus G. The budget always has to balance. This equation tells us how much energy is actually available for that skyward journey of water versus just heating things up.
It's hard to actually see invisible water vapor leaving, say, a whole lake. But you mentioned sources with visuals, charts and things.
Yes, data visualizations that really help tell the story.
Cool. So what's the first story these charts tell?
Well, one set compares the total incoming solar energy with that net radiation we just talked about.
Okay, so how much energy arrives versus how much is actually used for those budget items?
Exactly, because not all the sun's energy makes it into that surface budget. Some gets reflected straight back up, some gets absorbed by the atmosphere itself.
Ah, right.
And the charts show how this differs drastically depending on the surface. A bright desert reflects a lot, so less energy might be available as wonder dollars for evaporation compared to, say, a dark, dense forest, which absorbs more.
So the landscape itself changes how the sun's energy budget is spent. That makes sense. What else?
Another really interesting visualization shows how evapotranspiration that combined water loss changes throughout the year. Seasonal ET trends.
Like more in summer, less in winter.
Generally, yes, but the charts show it across different climate types, and often you see this slight delay.
A delay, what do you mean?
Well, the peak water loss, the highest ET rate, might happen a bit after the absolute hottest part of the summer.
Really? Why is that? You'd think hottest means most evaporation.
You would, but it highlights other factors. Maybe the soil is starting to dry out by peak summer, so even though it's hot, there's less water available for plants to transpire. Or maybe the plants themselves sort of regulate things. It shows it's not just about temperature.
Huh. It's like the system has a bit of a memory or a buffer. That is interesting. And is that lag important?
Oh, absolutely. Understanding that lag is critical for water resource management and for accurate climate modeling. It tells us about the interplay between energy, water availability, and biology.
Okay, fascinating. What's the third story?
This one really drives home the challenge of measurement. It relates to using something called a Class A evaporation pan.
Okay, like a standard tub of water they use to measure.
Exactly. But the chart shows how the evaporation rate from that pan changes depending on what's around it, specifically upwind.
Upwind, like the direction the wind is coming from.
Yes. Imagine the pan is sitting in the middle of a huge field of lush, wet, irrigated grass.
Okay.
The wind blowing over all that wet grass becomes quite humid before it even reaches the pan. So the pan evaporates relatively slowly because the air is already moist.
Ah, the air isn't as thirsty by the time it gets there.
Precisely. Now contrast that with the same pan sitting in the middle of dry, bare, hot dirt.
The air blowing over the dirt stays dry.
Right. So when that dry air hits the pan, it evaporates water much faster. The chart shows this Upwind-Fesch effect clearly.
Wow. So the exact same pan, same weather maybe, evaporates differently just based on its immediate surroundings.
It really highlights how careful you have to be. You can't just measure pan evaporation and assume it directly tells you the evaporation from a nearby lake or field without considering the context.
That makes measuring this stuff sound really tricky then. How do scientists get reliable numbers for big areas?
Well, since you can't count every water molecule, they use clever estimation methods, like detective work using different clues.
Okay, clue number one.
Clue number one uses that pan evaporation method we just discussed, but with a correction factor.
Ah, accounting for the surroundings.
Exactly. They measure the pan evaporation and then multiply it by a pan coefficient, KPT, to estimate the evaporation from a larger water body like a lake. So A lake times AP.
A magic number, KP2. How do they know what number to use?
It's based on lots of research. It typically falls between 0.65 and 0.85. It depends on things like the humidity, the wind, and those surroundings we talked about, the fetch. It adjusts the small pan reading to be more representative of the big lake. It's practical, but you need the right coefficient.
Makes sense. Okay, what's the next method?
The second is the water budget method. This is like balancing a checkbook for a lake or a river basin.
Okay, accounting for money in, money out, but with water.
Precisely. You measure all the water coming in, rain, rivers flowing in, groundwater seeping in. Then you measure all the water going OUT, rivers flowing out, groundwater seeping out. And you also measure the change in how much water is stored in the lake or reservoir itself. Deltas, did the water level go up or down?
Okay, so you track all the ins, all the outs, and the change in storage.
And whatever amount of water is missing from that budget, that's assumed to be the water that evaporated. The equation looks like EP plus kin plus G phi plus GA delta Acela.
That sounds straightforward in theory.
In theory, yes. But in practice, measuring all those terms accurately can be really hard. Especially the groundwater flows, they can be very tricky to quantify.
I can imagine. So when does this method work best?
It tends to work better over longer time periods like a month or a whole season or even a year. Over longer times, some of the short-term measurement errors tend to average out, giving you a more reliable estimate of the total evaporation.
Okay, that makes sense. Long-term balancing. Is there a third way?
Yes, a third major approach is the aerodynamic or mass transfer method. This one relies more directly on physics and weather conditions.
Aerodynamic. Sounds like it involves wind.
It does. It basically says that evaporation depends heavily on two main things: how fast the wind is blowing, right above the water,
Okay, wind speed.
and how dry the air is compared to the air right at the water surface. That's the difference in vapor pressure between the surface and the air above.
So fast wind plus very dry air equals faster evaporation.
Exactly. Think of the wind as constantly sweeping away the moist air right above the water, allowing more water to escape into the drier air moving in.
Like a conveyor belt for water vapor.
A good analogy. The equation often looks something like M batto, omi is them, M as is wind speed, is that is the vapor pressure difference, the dryness gradient.
And M, another magic number.
M is a mass transfer coefficient. It bundles up factors related to air turbulence and surface properties. Scientists did extensive studies, like on Lake Hefner mentioned in the sources, to figure out the best values for M under different conditions.
So they used real-world lake measurements to fine-tune the physics equation.
That's right. It shows how understanding the physics of air movement and humidity can give us pretty good estimates just from basic weather data.
Wow. So 3 quite different ways to get at the same visible process. Pan coefficients, water budgets, and aerodynamics.
Indeed. And they all contribute to our understanding. So, pulling it all together, what we've seen is that this journey of water back to the sky, evaporation and transpiration, it's incredibly complex, but also quite elegant. It's powered fundamentally by the sun's energy, which gets carefully budgeted at the Earth's surface. It's influenced by everything: temperature, humidity, wind, the plants, the soil. And measuring it requires some real scientific ingenuity, combining direct observation, careful accounting, and a solid grasp of physics.
Yeah, it really makes you appreciate what's happening unseen. So next time you see a puddle drying up after rain, or even just feel the wind on a warm day, remember those tiny water molecules? They aren't just vanishing. They're on this incredible upward journey. They're heading back into the atmosphere, playing their part in the huge water cycle that keeps our planet running, shapes our weather, and, well, makes life possible. What part of this whole skyward journey stands out most to you? Maybe next time you'll notice just how much faster things dry on a windy day versus a still one. There's always more to see, isn't there? Right in the world around us.